welcome back to my series on subclassing for tanks. In this video I want to go over Soldier of Apocrypha. Generally speaking, Soldier of Apocrypha is one of the tankiest lines in the game, offering insane damage shields and some very upfront loaded skills. Starting off, let's talk about the one and only class Taunt. Runic Jolt is the only class Taunt in the game, and it applies minor maim and also gives a damage taken reduction per crux active. Runic Jolt and Morphs are one of only 2 crux generators in the entirety of the Soldier of Apocrypha skill line. Looking at the base morph though, the damage taken reduction is 2% per crux, which on its own isn't that strong. However, it's completely passive, and if you don't have anything else consuming crux, it's just gonna be there. Minor maim, on the other hand, is a very accessible debuff that can be applied from a variety of different things throughout the game. The other downside of this skill and its morphs is the slightly lower range. 22 meters, while still a lot, will sometimes get annoying at best and can actually screw you up at worst if you're used to Inner Fire or Frost Clench. As for the morphs, let's start with Runic Embrace. This skill is basically useless, as all you get for a morph is minor lifesteal. This is great, however, Alter also gives minor lifesteal and a massive AoE. Minor lifesteal is a buff that's going to be provided by the healer basically everywhere, and by the tank and 4-man if you're running without a healer. Runic Sunder is the other morph, and instead of giving minor lifesteal, you instead siphon 2200 armor from an enemy. This alone makes it the better morph, however, it's not always the most useful thing, as getting to penetration cap nowadays with subclassing is a lot easier than it used to be. One thing to mention about this skill is since it siphons the armor, you actually gain the 2200 armor as well, and with it being a taunt, you will probably have this up 100% of the time, meaning you can actually build around it. However, if you're not using the taunt as your only taunt, there's really no reason to run it for the armor. While the armor penetration is nice on this skill, there are other options like the Crusher Enchant and Alkosh, even though Alkosh isn't used as much anymore by groups. Overall though, Runic Jolt and Sunder are very strong skills in specific circumstances. If the penetration is needed, you'll probably end up wanting to use this. However, if you're not in that circumstance, it's just a lower ranged worse taunt. Next up, we have Rune Spite Ward. Rune Spite Ward is a very wordy skill that kind of just boils down to big shield that gives you healing when cast. The heal amount can vary based on the crux consumed. However, if you consume 3 crux, the heal is quite chunky and will burst you to full health pretty quickly. Starting off with the morphs, we have Spite Ward of the Lucent Mind. Lucent Mind makes it so that the shield refunds the cost by up to 90% based on crux consumed. This can effectively make the skill free to cast at 3 crux. The other morph of the skill, and probably the more commonly used one, is Impervious Rune Ward. This is, well, probably the single strongest shield in the game. The reason I say this is the strongest shield when things like Barrier and, well, this line's ultimate exist is because this shield can technically be spammed. Impervious Rune Ward offers a massive damage shield for 1 second after the cast. The downside is, this enormous shield subsides, the secondary shield that you gain afterwards is severely reduced. This kind of functions like a parry in other video games. However, using a shield in ESO comes with some drawbacks, as it's really not great for blocking direct damage, as direct damage is so high base that using a shield basically does nothing to it. However, Impervious Rune Ward kind of breaks this. It is such a strong upfront shield that you can actually reduce direct hits by quite a substantial margin just with the shield alone. The other issue with the shield comes when taking a bunch of dot damage. Dots you cannot block, and blocking really just does nothing to them. The shield does not last very long against them, as you'll mitigate basically all of the damage for a second, they will break the shield and you'll have to recast it. If you're fine with spamming it, it's okay, but one shield won't get you through that much of a dot. Overall, between the 2 morphs, they are both decently good. However, most people will probably move towards Impervious Rune Ward just due to how strong the upfront shield is. Lucent Mind itself isn't terrible and is a nice skill to have because it is essentially a free cast. However, just the raw upfront strength of Impervious Rune Ward makes it hard to overlook. Next up, we have Fate Woven Armor. This is the skill that I would usually crap on, as it's the class's major resolve skill. With the skill Frostcloak in existence, most major resolve skills don't really serve a purpose. However, Fate Woven Armor kind of breaks this, as it applies secondary effects that can make it useful. Fate-Woven Armor applies major resolve to the caster. When the caster takes damage, Fate-Woven Armor applies minor breach to the target for 6 seconds. Looking into the morphs, we have Unbreakable Fate. This turns the skill into a Crux Consumer. This is the biggest downfall of the morph. You gain 5% block mitigation per Crux consumed. This sounds pretty good in a vacuum. However, Immovable just exists. Immovable offers the same bonuses to block mitigation, however it's a bit stronger and applies a CC. The major difference is Unbreakable doesn't apply the CC, is weaker, and then has to use Crux to generate the block mitigation. Immovable, however, you can just pop whenever you want to. Immovable does apply a pretty harsh snare, however in the fights where you would want something like Immovable to have that high a block mitigation, the snare doesn't really matter. Looking at the other morph, we have Cruxweaver Armor. Cruxweaver Armor turns it from being a Crux Consumer into a Crux Generator. You lose the block mitigation, however, if you get hit while Cruxweaver Armor is active, you generate a Crux. While on its own, this doesn't sound extremely important. If you're not using the class taunt, this is the only way you'll actually get Crux for skills like Impervious Rune Ward. Overall, out of all of the morphs, I would probably choose Cruxweaver Armor, as using a Crux Consumer is a very specific thing, and if you're using multiple Crux Consumers, it can be hard to manage that. Especially now with subclassing, you don't have that many options when it comes to Crux generation, and if you're not doing double of the same class, then you really don't have a lot of options in the Soldier of Apocrypha skill line. Getting as much Crux as possible can also help with certain things, like using the passive damage reduction from the taunt and other things like that, or just healing with the shield. Next up, we have Runic Defense. Runic Defense is probably one of the largest skill blocks in the game that can be broken down into. It's a minor resolve skill that gives minor protection. Under 50% health, if you take damage, you eat the minor protection to then heal for a pretty large chunk of health. The first morph is Rune Guard of Freedom. Freedom changes what happens when you consume the minor protection under 50% health. You keep the heal, though now it is smaller, and gain armor and crowd control immunity. While on paper this can seem nice, the armor is basically useless, as yeah, you get it when you will need it, but if you're building around the 3300 armor granted by this skill, you will only get it while actively taking damage under 50% health, and if it's not up 100% of the time, it's just kind of a waste, as you should just be at armor cap anyway. Crowd control immunity is just something nice to have. It can be beneficial, it can be not. If you're getting a lot of CCs on you, then you know it's nice to just have crowd control immunity. However, if you don't have anything on you, then there's really no point to it. Next up, we have Rune Guard of Still Waters. This is basically just Runic Defense, however you gain an immobilization circle on cast. If you can make use of an immobilization, it's great. If you can't, then it does basically nothing different from the base morph. Between the two morphs, I would choose Rune Guard of Still Waters most of the time, as the bigger heal is just nicer. Yes, you gain an immobilization that basically does nothing, but the CC immunity and armor gained from the other morph isn't that great for losing the massive heal. You keep some of the heal, but it's just not as big, and I like the other morph more. Last up for the active skills, we have Rune of the Eldritch Horde. The base version of this morph applies minor vulnerability and stuns a target. Minor vulnerability is one of those debuffs that can be applied from a number of different sources, and really at the end of the day is just going to be up from something random and you might not even know you're doing it. The stun, however, is nice, but the things you'll be casting Rune of Eldritch Horror on basically cannot be stunned. Starting off with the first morph, I'm gonna be honest, I didn't even know this morph did something different. I didn't know what it did until I read stuff for this script. But we have Rune of the Uncanny Adoration. You still apply minor vuln, but instead of stunning, you charm the enemy, which basically just forces them to run towards you. Realistically, this isn't too much different than an actual stun, as charming just forces an enemy to not attack you, and instead of keeping them still, it pulls them towards you. Lastly, we have Rune of the Colorless Pool. Colorless Pool trades the charm of Uncanny to regain the stun and minor brittle. Weirdly, while minor brittle should be one of the easier buffs to keep up for a tank, I won't lie and say that I do this perfectly every time, and I don't use Colorless Pool because I'm lazy. I weirdly value this skill a little bit higher because of just pure laziness. Minor brittle isn't difficult to keep up, however it can just be annoying, and this skill does it super easily just by pressing one button and getting 20 seconds of brittle. Overall, between the two morphs, there's really not a reason to not pick Colorless Pool. It just gives brittle over a charm, and brittle is a far more powerful debuff than charm is in PvE. Now let's look at the ultimate. Jbering Shield is probably the most powerful damage shield in the game. It has the highest tooltip of any shield, however it only blocks 60% of incoming damage. While this practically makes the tank behind the shield immortal, it does technically mean that you could get hit through it and killed. But anyway, Jbering Shield absorbs all the damage done to it and releases it in a 5 meter AoE as a 10-second dot. While you can do decent damage with this, you're basically using your ultimate for selfish reasons, and there's really no use for it in PvE, as the damage output from it isn't actually that high. As for the first morph, we have Sanctum of the Abyssal Sea. This is effectively the same skill with a larger shield. This does mean it will do more damage, however it runs into the same issue as the base skill. Now on to the final morph, Jbering Shelter. What once used to be the strongest damage shield in the game is now nowhere near as strong as it used to be. Jbering Shield applies a damage shield to the caster. When this caster is damaged, it will apply another damage shield to 11 allies within 15 meters. This damage shield is a lot smaller and can be applied every 4 seconds. Overall though, between the morphs, Abyssal Sanctum is just not great in PvE, as retaliation damage from a tank usually ends up not doing all that much, and Jbering is just really strong still. It's nowhere near as broken as it used to be, however, it's still a pretty good option for defensive uses if you're just scared of whatever is going on right then and there. Time for the passives, usually the best part where half of these just don't do anything, except it's kind of different here. A lot of the passives for the Arcanist are actually decent. First off, we have Impeccable Outcome. This is your ultimate generation passive and it requires you to consume Crux. This basically forces you into running Rune wards somewhere. While not inherently a bad thing, we just don't have infinite bar space as a tank, so something else could have gone here. One thing to note, this is being made before the update comes out where the class ultimate stuff is getting changed, so when that happens, this ultimate generation crap will change, and like you may not need this because you'll have other ultimate generation, and it's stupid, but whatever. Up next, we have Circumvented Fate. All this passive does is provide minor evasion for 20 seconds when you cast an Arcanist ability. It has a 5-second cooldown, making this passive have basically 100% uptime if you're doing anything. Here's the thing about it though. Minor evasion is one of the rarest buffs in the game. There are only 3 sources of it, including Circumvented Fate, with the other 2 basically being useless. This makes Soldier of Apocrypha almost required somewhere in comp with how Zos loves to AoE spam every fight nowadays. For the third passive, we have Wellspring of the Abyss. It's a sustain passive. If you need it, that's great. If you don't, it's still doing something, maybe. Sustain passives live and die off of whether or not you yourself actually need it. And finally, we come to Ages of the Unseen. While you have a beneficial Soldier of Apocrypha ability active on you, Rune Guard, Cruxweaver, or Rune Ward, you'll gain a chunk of armor, 3,271 to be exact. This amount of armor is actually pretty good, and if you're using Cruxweaver, you'll have it on basically the entire fight, so it's a decent chunk of armor to build around. Overall, Soldier of Apocrypha is a very strong tank tree that is more focused on selfish survivability than fully helping the group. There are some damage increases and some group dependent buffs like the minor evasion from Circumvented Fate. However, a lot of the tanking tree itself becomes a lot more selfish and just is typically more useful to the tank itself than anyone else. However, with something like Circumvented Fate being almost required in a lot of the new fights, it is a good idea to have this on someone and it benefits the tank the most. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Soldier of Apocrypha is one of those trees that is just ungodly tanky and just has a lot of stuff going on in it. It seems like their newer classes, they like to load the skills with more and more buffs, making them weirder and weirder to use, or just end up overriding almost anything anyone else does. The last thing I wanted to mention for anyone still watching is this video took a while because I was messing around with some stuff and trying to fix some of the things I wanted to work on with this, and hopefully I'll be able to get them out a little bit quicker now. But I hope you enjoyed and thanks for watching.